My name is Nadia, and I am 33 years old. Before my brother's wedding, my parents gave me 3 conditions if I wanted to attend. Complete all of them, and we will let you come. I simply smiled, booked a beach vacation to Malibu, and mailed one final gift. When my brother opened it in front of hundreds of guests, he screamed in terror. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the elite circles of Washington, D.C. meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My father, Richard, and my mother, Vivica, cared about one thing above all else, and that was their image. They were pillars of the Black American elite in the capital, obsessed with generational wealth, exclusive social networks, and maintaining a flawless public facade. My younger brother Julian was their golden child. He was 31 years old, suave, arrogant, and highly favored despite his sheer incompetence. I was the scapegoat. I chose to build my own empire instead of relying on their conditional support. As the founder and CEO of a top crisis public relations firm, I made a fortune cleaning up scandals for politicians and executives. I was sharp, independent, and untouchable, which was exactly why my parents resented me. The real confrontation began on a brisk Tuesday morning when my mother summoned me to their exclusive country club in Potomac. The atmosphere dripped with generational wealth and unspoken rules. Valets rushed to open doors for members who wore their status like armor. I arrived expecting a standard, tense family luncheon where my mother would criticize my hair and my father would boast about Julian's latest mediocre achievement at the Family Investment Trust. I walked into the private dining room and found them already seated at a heavy mahogany table near the window. There were no pleasantries. There was no asking how my business was doing or how I was feeling. The air was immediately suffocating. My father sat stiffly in his tailored suit, his face a mask of grim determination. My mother adjusted her pearls, her eyes cold and calculating. Before I even pulled out my chair to sit down, my father slid a thick, heavily redacted legal folder across the pristine white tablecloth. It stopped right in front of me. I looked at the folder, then at them, my crisis management instincts instantly flaring to life. In my line of work, a sudden, unscheduled meeting accompanied by legal documents never meant anything good. I did not touch the folder. I kept my hands folded in my lap and waited for them to speak, refusing to give them the satisfaction of showing surprise. Vivica leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers resting on the table. She spoke with a terrifyingly calm authority, dictating the terms for my presence at Julian's upcoming society wedding. He was marrying Simone, the haughty 29-year-old daughter of a federal judge and a prominent mega-church bishop from Atlanta. The union was supposed to be the social event of the decade, a merging of two powerful, wealthy families. My mother looked me dead in the eye and stated that I would only be allowed to attend if I met 3 specific conditions. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Condition 1 was staggering. They demanded that I sign over my 25% stake in a prime commercial property located in downtown Washington, D.C. This building had been left exclusively to me by my grandfather, the only person in this family who ever recognized my grit and potential. He knew Julian was a pampered liability, so he protected me by leaving the asset in my name. My mother explained that Julian needed the property transferred to him immediately to prove his asset liquidity to Simone's powerful family. They needed to secure his image as a wealthy, capable groom, and my inheritance was the collateral they required to pull off the illusion. I stared at the paper, processing the sheer audacity of the demand. I had spent years dealing with aggressive corporate lawyers and corrupt politicians, but seeing my own flesh and blood attempt to legally rob me over a brunch table was a new level of betrayal. But she was not finished. Condition 2 was just as insulting. My father chimed in, his tone dripping with unearned entitlement. He stated that I was expected to gift $150,000 in cash to the wedding fund. This money was meant to cover the extravagant champagne tier for the reception, a ridiculous expense they wanted me to shoulder without any recognition. When I asked why on earth I would fund Julian's vanity project, my mother delivered the justification with practiced cruelty. She sneered and told me that since I had no husband and no children to spend my money on, I had cash to spare. In her eyes, my status as a 33-year-old single woman meant my hard-earned wealth was community property for the golden child to exploit. She spoke as if my success was a compensation prize for failing to secure a husband, and therefore my money rightfully belonged to the brother who was fulfilling the family's traditional expectations. They were not asking for a favor. They were demanding a ransom. They expected me to strip myself of my financial security and hand over my inheritance just to buy a ticket to a party that I barely even wanted to attend. The entitlement was sickening, but I kept my face entirely neutral. Letting them see my anger would only give them power. Then came condition 3, the ultimate humiliation designed to crush whatever pride I had left. My mother reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a fabric swatch. She informed me that if I agreed to the financial terms and attended the wedding, I was forbidden from wearing anything stylish or elegant. I was to wear a dull, shapeless gray dress that she had personally selected. Furthermore, I would not be seated with the immediate family at the front of the ballroom. Instead, I would be assigned to a back table near the kitchen doors, seated with distant relatives and plus ones. Her reasoning was simple and brutal. She wanted to hide my spinster status so I would not embarrass the family in front of Simone's elite guests. A single, independent woman in her 30s was a blemish on their perfect portrait, and she wanted me effectively erased from the visual narrative of the day. They wanted my money, they wanted my property, but they did not actually want me. I was to be a silent, invisible benefactor financing their grand illusion while being treated like an unwanted burden. I sat in silence, absorbing the overwhelming toxicity radiating from across the table. I did not cry. I did not yell. Years of dealing with high-stakes corporate extortion had trained me to detach my emotions from my logic. As I looked at the transfer deeds and listened to their demands, my mind started racing. People obsessed with image do not suddenly demand a massive property transfer and a six-figure cash injection just to show off. They do it because they are desperate. They do it because they are drowning. Something was drastically, fundamentally wrong with the family's finances, and Julian was clearly at the center of it. A wealthy family with a pristine reputation does not attempt to extort their estranged daughter unless they have exhausted every other legal avenue. My brother was vice president of the Family Investment Trust, a position he acquired through nepotism rather than merit. If he was suddenly desperate for liquid assets and high-value commercial collateral right before a union with a powerful federal judge's daughter, he was hiding a catastrophic failure. I looked back at my parents, a cold, calculated strategy already forming in my mind. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought my desire for family acceptance would override my business sense. They were dead wrong. I did not just manage crises, I dismantled the people who caused them. And as I stared at the redacted folder on the table, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I was going to dig into every hidden ledger, every secret account, and every dirty transaction my golden child brother had ever made. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of extortion, but they had severely underestimated the opponent sitting across from them. The war had officially begun. I would not let them win. I refused to be their sacrificial lamb any longer. Every demand they made today would serve as the rope they would eventually use to hang their own elite legacy. I took a deep breath, preparing to deliver my response. Before I could utter a single word in response to their absurd ultimatum, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. My brother Julian strolled in wearing a bespoke tailored suit that practically screamed unearned wealth. On his arm was his fiancée, Simone. She was the picture of Atlanta high society draped in designer labels with a massive diamond resting heavily on her finger. They moved with the synchronized arrogance of a couple completely detached from reality. Julian pulled out a chair for Simone before taking the seat next to my father. He looked at me with a lazy, self-satisfied smirk, entirely convinced that I had already capitulated to our parents' demands. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply leaned back, steepled his fingers, and asked if the paperwork was ready for the notary. Simone sipped her sparkling water and looked me up and down. Her gaze was evaluating and intensely patronizing. She let out a small, breathless laugh and leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. She said she was so glad I could take a break from my little crisis agency to help Julian secure their future. She referred to my elite, multi-million-dollar public relations firm as a glorified janitorial service for misbehaving politicians. She spoke the words slowly, ensuring the insult landed with maximum impact. According to Simone, true power came from generational legacy and federal appointments, not from cleaning up other people's messes. I watched Julian beam with pride at her condescension. He actually reached over and patted my hand, a gesture so dripping with fake sympathy I had to resist the urge to pull away. He told me not to take it personally. He said my money and the commercial property were finally going to be put to good use, elevating the family name to heights my small business never could. He acted as if my compliance was a foregone conclusion. He assumed that because I was the scapegoat, I would naturally sacrifice my assets to buy my way into his good graces. Simone chimed in again, smoothing her flawless hair. She mentioned that her father, the federal judge, was very particular about the financial standing of the family she was marrying into. She said Julian needed the commercial property deed transferred today, so her father's accountants could finalize the prenuptial asset review. She added that her father's megachurch congregation was expecting a wedding that rivaled royalty, and the champagne tier I was funding was the bare minimum required to meet their standards. She spoke to me as if I were a stubborn bank teller holding up her transaction, completely ignoring the fact that she was demanding my personal wealth. The sheer delusion in the room was palpable. They really believed they could insult my life's work, belittle my existence, and walk away with my grandfather's legacy and a massive cash injection, all because they demanded it. It was a stunning display of entitlement, a performance they had rehearsed their entire lives, fully expecting me to play my assigned role as the obedient, disposable underling. I looked directly at Julian, then at Simone, and finally shifted my gaze to my parents. The room grew quiet, the expectant silence heavy with their collective arrogance. I folded my hands on the table and let my voice drop to an icy, absolute calm. I told them no. I said I would not sign over my property. I would not pay a single cent for their champagne. And I would certainly not sit in the back of a ballroom wearing a cheap dress to hide their insecurities. The refusal hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. For a fraction of a second, absolute shock registered on their faces. Julian's smirk vanished. Simone's patronizing smile melted into a scowl. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls as if I had physically struck her. But it was my father who reacted with terrifying hostility. Richard dropped his aristocratic, refined facade entirely. The polished gentleman of Washington society disappeared, replaced by a ruthless, calculating extortionist. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the crystal glasses, and drawing the attention of the waitstaff, whom he promptly dismissed with a furious wave of his hand. He leaned over the table, his face flushed with rage, and told me I was making a catastrophic mistake. He said I owed this family for the privilege of carrying our last name. When I reminded him that I built my agency from the ground up without a dime of his money, he laughed. It was a cruel, abrasive sound. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a menacing register. He threatened to destroy everything I had built. He reminded me of his powerful fraternity connections, his lifelong membership in the exclusive Bull Network, and his deep ties to the political elite of the capital. He promised to leverage every single high society connection he possessed to smear my firm. He swore he would initiate silent boycotts among the city's power brokers, utilizing the Jack and Jill alumni networks to spread whispers of incompetence and breach of confidentiality. He said he would ensure that my crisis management agency was blacklisted from every major corporate board and political campaign in Washington. He detailed how he would bleed my client list dry, poisoning my reputation by planting stories in the society pages until no respectable politician or executive would dare associate with me. He told me that in this city, perception is reality, and he controlled the perception. He boasted that he could make one phone call to the banking sector and have my most lucrative corporate contracts terminated by Monday morning. He demanded to know how my precious business would survive when the very people I sought to protect viewed me as an untrustworthy, unstable liability. He painted a vivid picture of my financial ruin, describing how I would lose my high-rise office, my elite status, and the independence I guarded so fiercely. He made it perfectly clear that this was not a negotiation. It was pure, unadulterated extortion. If I embarrassed them by refusing to fund Julian's marital image, they would publicly and professionally annihilate me without a second thought. My mother joined the assault, her voice a venomous whisper. She told me that I had always been selfish, always putting my own stubborn ambition above the family's legacy. She stated that if I forced them to ruin me, I would have no one to blame but myself. She reminded me that blood is thicker than water, but only when it serves the family's purpose. They were utterly convinced that their coordinated threats would break my resolve. They believed my fear of losing my agency would force my hand to the pen. They sat back in their chairs, chests puffed with arrogant superiority, waiting for the panic to set in, waiting for me to beg for their mercy and eagerly sign the documents to save my livelihood. They expected tears, apologies, and total submission to their absolute authority. Instead of crying, instead of arguing, and instead of showing a single ounce of the fear they so desperately wanted to see, I remained perfectly still. I looked at the four of them, a gallery of narcissists, convinced they held the keys to my destruction. My crisis management brain was already 5 steps ahead, processing their desperate threats, not as power, but as a glaring confirmation of their own profound vulnerability. You do not threaten to burn down your daughter's business over a champagne bill unless you are standing on the edge of an absolute financial abyss. I calmly stood up from the table. The scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor echoed loudly in the tense silence of the private dining room. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored designer coat, deliberately taking my time, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating for them. I picked up my luxury handbag and slung it over my shoulder with practiced elegance. I looked down at my father, whose face was still red with exertion, and at my mother, who was glaring at me with poorly concealed anxiety. I offered them a chillingly calm, polite smile that did not reach my eyes. "I will give you my final answer by Friday," I said. My voice was smooth, carrying no trace of intimidation. I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I did not look back at Julian's sudden confusion or Simone's shocked indignation. I left them sitting at the table, surrounded by their empty threats and unearned arrogance, exuding a dangerous calm that I knew would leave them sweating until the end of the week. My exit was flawless, projecting a quiet confidence that completely undermined their display of aggression. I was walking away from their ambush entirely unscathed. As soon as the elevator doors of my high-rise office building slid open, I shifted seamlessly from targeted victim into absolute predator. The plush carpets and soundproof glass walls of my Washington agency usually offered a sanctuary of quiet luxury, but today they transformed instantly into a war room. I bypassed the receptionist with a sharp gesture indicating I was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. I locked the heavy oak door of my corner office behind me and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Capitol building. The adrenaline from the country club encounter had faded, leaving behind a cold and hyper-focused clarity. I poured myself a single measure of bourbon, not to soothe my nerves, but to sharpen my senses. My crisis public relations mind cataloged every word, every threat, and every micro-expression my parents and brother had displayed. Extortion was a desperate man's game. My grandfather had known this day would come. He was the only self-made titan in our lineage, a man who built his real estate portfolio with calloused hands and an iron will. He despised the performative aristocratic masquerade my parents had adopted. During his final days, when his mind was still razor-sharp, despite his failing body, He called me into his study. I remember the harsh smell of his cigars and the heavy weight of his stare. He handed me the deed to the commercial property in downtown Washington with a grim expression. He told me that Julian was a pampered liability, a boy playing dress-up in tailored suits, who would eventually burn the family empire to the ground. My grandfather saw right through Julian's charming facade, recognizing the lethal combination of arrogance and profound incompetence. He knew my parents would endlessly cover for my brother, shielding him from the consequences of his own mediocrity. He chose me because he saw my grit. He saw the fire in my eyes when my parents dismissed my ambitions. He entrusted me with his most valuable asset because he knew I would never surrender it to save a sinking ship. He warned me that one day Julian's staggering ineptitude would backfire and the family would demand I sacrifice my security to rescue their golden child. His voice echoed in my head as I stared out at the city skyline. He had told me to hold the line and let them drown. I placed my empty glass on the desk. They genuinely believed their threats would paralyze me. They assumed I was still the marginalized daughter desperate for a seat at their elite table. But I had spent the last decade navigating political scandals, corporate espionage, and ruthless boardroom assassinations. I destroyed powerful adversaries for a living. By threatening to destroy my agency, they had not just insulted me, they had fundamentally threatened my survival. I remembered the way my grandfather grasped my hand, his grip unyielding, telling me that blood was only a biological accident and loyalty must be earned. He warned me that Vivica and Richard would weaponize guilt, but guilt was a useless emotion in business. I was no longer the little girl seeking their validation. I was the architect of my own destiny. My parents had crossed a fatal line today. By dragging my business into their blackmail scheme, they had declared war. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, booting up my multi-monitor setup. The time for family loyalty was over. It was time to execute a surgical strike. I pressed the intercom button and summoned my lead corporate intelligence operative Marcus to my office. My agency did not just write press releases and draft public apologies. We maintained an elite covert investigative division tasked with uncovering the deepest secrets of our opposition before they could be used against my clients. Today, I was my own client. Marcus entered silently, bringing an encrypted tablet and a demeanor of absolute professionalism. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I instructed him to launch a full-scale forensic dive into the financial footprints of Julian and Richard. I wanted every bank statement, every offshore ledger, every tax filing, and every trust fund allocation dissected and laid bare. Marcus raised an eyebrow, sensing the personal nature of the request, but he knew better than to ask questions. I detailed the parameters of the search, focusing specifically on liquidity issues and sudden asset transfers within the last 6 months. Wealthy socialites like my parents do not corner their estranged daughter in a country club and resort to mafia-style extortion over a mere $150,000 champagne bill. That kind of erratic, aggressive behavior reeks of a catastrophic cash flow crisis. People who possess genuine wealth simply write a check. People who are completely bankrupt try to steal it from their relatives. I told Marcus to trace the history of the family investment trust that Julian supposedly managed with such brilliance. I needed to know exactly where the capital was flowing. I suspected my brother had been playing fast and loose with the principal, but I needed concrete numbers. Furthermore, I directed my team to scrutinize the impending wedding. A society wedding involving a federal judge's daughter is a massive financial undertaking. The pressure to match the bride's family in spending would be astronomical for a man like my father, who defined his entire worth by his social standing. If Julian had drained the family coffers, they would be absolutely desperate to maintain the illusion of parity. I gave Marcus a strict deadline. I needed actionable intelligence by the end of the day. The extortion attempt was crude and clumsy, meaning they were operating on an extremely tight timeline. The wedding was fast approaching, and whatever financial hole Julian had dug for himself was clearly about to cave in. Marcus nodded, sharply logged the parameters into his secure network, and left the room to mobilize our forensic accountants. I leaned back slowly, feeling the familiar thrill of the hunt. My parents had foolishly handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their narrative. They wanted to play games with my livelihood, so I was going to unearth every skeleton buried in their immaculate closets. I tapped my pen against the desk, running through potential scenarios. If Julian had merely made bad investments, my father would have quietly liquidated a lesser property to cover the loss. That they specifically targeted my commercial asset meant their own assets were either already gone or legally encumbered. They were grasping at my wealth because they literally had nothing left of their own. The facade of the black elite was about to be shattered. It did not take long for the facade to officially collapse. Barely 4 hours had passed when Marcus returned to my office, placing a heavily encrypted drive on my desk. The preliminary data had rolled in faster than anticipated because the financial devastation was too massive to properly conceal. I connected the drive to my secure terminal and pulled up the detailed financial flowcharts. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold smirk form on my lips. Julian's incompetence was far worse than even my grandfather could have predicted. The golden child had completely bled the family trust dry. The forensic trace revealed a labyrinth of off-the-books shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Julian had systematically funneled millions of dollars from the family's conservative generational wealth funds into these dummy corporations. From there, the money had been recklessly dumped into highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency portfolios. He had chased massive speculative yields, hoping to prove his genius to the elite circles he so desperately wanted to impress. Instead, he had engineered a financial apocalypse. The market data aligned perfectly with the timeline of his withdrawals. Julian had bought at the absolute peak of a crypto bubble and held on to the assets as they plummeted into worthlessness. He had engaged in margin trading, borrowing heavily against the family's remaining liquid assets to cover his catastrophic losses. The margin calls had triggered a rapid liquidation, wiping out everything. My parents were entirely bankrupt. The country club memberships, the designer clothes, the sprawling Potomac estate, it was all being funded by rapidly compounding credit debt and high-interest bridge loans. Julian had gambled away the entire family legacy on virtual coins and lost. My father's desperate threat to destroy my business suddenly made perfect sense. He was not just trying to protect his son's pride, he was trying to prevent total social and financial annihilation. They needed my commercial property because it was the only unencumbered asset left in the entire family lineage. They intended to use my building as collateral to secure a massive emergency loan to keep up appearances for Simone's powerful parents. Without my property, Julian would be exposed as a penniless fraud before he ever reached the altar. I scrolled through the devastating ledgers, marveling at their audacity. They had tried to bully a crisis manager while leaving a paper trail of absolute ruin. The trap was ready, and they had willingly walked right into it. I finalized the data extraction and secured the vital files offline. It was time to prepare for their next inevitable strike. Section 4, 1,500 words. As I continued to sift through the encrypted offline files, my initial satisfaction quickly curdled into a cold and absolute dread. Losing the generational wealth was a catastrophic failure of judgment, but it was not inherently illegal. Bad investments happen every day in the financial sector. However, the forensic trace Marcus had provided contained a secondary layer of data that required a deeper decryption key. I initiated the bypass protocol and watched as a hidden ledger materialized on my screen. This was the true horror my brother had been desperately trying to conceal from the world. Julian did not just lose the family money. When the crypto markets crashed and the massive margin calls came due, he panicked. He realized that admitting his failure to our parents would shatter the golden child illusion he had cultivated his entire life. Instead of facing the consequences, he chose to cross a federal line. The digital paper trail laid out a textbook case of wire fraud and money laundering. To prevent the brokers from liquidating the remaining family assets, Julian had initiated a series of unauthorized wire transfers across state lines. He utilized a sophisticated network of ghost accounts to route capital through shell companies designed to look like legitimate institutional investors. He was desperately plugging the holes in his sinking ship with stolen funds. The sheer arrogance required to execute these transactions was staggering, but his execution was fundamentally flawed. He left digital fingerprints everywhere.
My crisis management agency specialized in dismantling exactly this kind of white-collar crime, tearing apart complex financial webs to expose the perpetrators hiding behind them. I recognized the patterns of a desperate amateur trying to play a high-stakes game with federal regulations. He had falsified digital signatures, manipulated routing numbers, and deliberately bypassed standard compliance checks. Each unauthorized transfer constituted a separate federal offense carrying severe mandatory minimum sentences. He had escalated a financial blunder into a massive criminal conspiracy. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the origin of the stolen capital. Julian was unemployed, essentially relying entirely on his fictitious title at our hollowed-out family trust. He had no wealthy benefactors or corporate sponsors to bail him out. The money he was illegally routing into the crypto exchanges had to be coming from an external and highly vulnerable source. I instructed my system to reverse engineer the transaction histories targeting the primary routing numbers Julian had compromised. I needed to know exactly who he had stolen from to fund his reckless gambling habit. As the decryption software chewed through the data, I realized the magnitude of the danger my parents had invited into my life. By attempting to extort my commercial property to cover Julian's tracks, they were actively conspiring to conceal a federal felony. If I had signed those transfer deeds blindly, I would have been legally implicated in a massive money laundering operation. My grandfather's commercial building would have been seized by the federal government, and my pristine professional reputation would have been annihilated overnight. My parents were not just bankrupt and desperate people trying to save face. They were incredibly dangerous conspirators operating without morals. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom and my future just to protect a criminal. The decryption progress bar hit 100%, and the screen populated with the origin details of the stolen funds. The identity of Julian's victim flashed across the screen, and the sheer audacity of his crime took my breath away. He had targeted someone intimately connected to his meticulously crafted public image. I stared at the name on the account, fully realizing the extortion was a ticking federal time bomb. The glowing text on my monitor confirmed a reality so twisted it felt almost cinematic. Julian had not just stolen from a random corporate entity or a faceless hedge fund. He had secretly embezzled over $2.5 million from the sprawling Atlanta megachurch charity fund managed exclusively by Simone's powerful father. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Simone's father was not just a prominent bishop with a congregation of tens of thousands. He was also a highly respected federal judge who sat on the appellate court. He was a man who wielded immense judicial and social power. A man whose entire legacy was built on absolute moral authority and strict legal compliance. To steal from him was not just a crime, it was an act of unfathomable stupidity. I accessed the internal church ledgers Marcus had managed to clone. The timeline of the embezzlement painted a vivid picture of manipulation and betrayal. Julian had used his impending marriage to Simone as a golden key to bypass the church's rigorous financial security protocols. He had positioned himself as the helpful, brilliant son-in-law eager to offer his elite financial services to optimize the charity's massive endowments. He had charmed the bishop sitting in the front pew every Sunday, playing the devoted Christian, while secretly cloning the administrative credentials required to access the offshore holding accounts. He exploited their absolute trust, leveraging the sacred bond of family to systematically bleed the charity dry. The $2.5 million were originally earmarked for building a massive community center and an affordable housing complex for underserved neighborhoods in Atlanta. Julian had taken the donations of thousands of hardworking families and flushed them down the drain of speculative cryptocurrency markets. He had stolen from the poor to fund his desperate gambling addiction under the guise of increasing the church's philanthropic yield. As I traced the final missing dollar, I realized exactly how precarious my brother's situation truly was. Simone patronizingly insulting my crisis management firm at the country club was the height of tragic irony. She had mocked my career while remaining completely oblivious to the fact that her future husband had just defrauded her own father out of millions. She was walking down the aisle with a man who was actively destroying her family's sacred legacy. Julian was trapped in an invisible cage of his own making. The wedding was rapidly approaching, which meant the bishop's annual financial disclosures were imminent. Simone's father would undoubtedly conduct a routine pre-wedding audit to ensure all charitable funds were properly allocated before formally welcoming Julian into their prestigious legal and religious dynasty. When that audit happened, the massive gaping hole in the charity accounts would be impossible to hide. The bishop would not just cancel the wedding, he would unleash the full wrath of the federal justice system upon my brother. He would personally ensure that Julian faced the maximum penalty for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. Julian had backed himself into a corner with a predator he could not charm or outsmart. I sat back in my chair, the glowing monitors illuminating the dark office. My parents' extortion attempt was no longer just an arrogant power play, it was a desperate, frantic scramble for survival. They needed a massive injection of untraceable cash, and they needed it immediately. They were trying to steal my grandfather's property to save their precious golden child from spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The sheer desperation of their illegal blackmail scheme finally made absolute perfect logical sense now. I connected the final dots, mapping out the exact sequence of their doomed survival strategy. Julian needed my commercial property because it was a tangible, highly valued asset with zero existing liens. His plan was straightforward but incredibly reckless. He intended to use the deed to my downtown building as ironclad collateral to secure an emergency high-interest bridge loan from a private shadow lender. Once the loan cleared, he would quickly and secretly wire the $2.5 million back into the Atlanta megachurch charity accounts. He was racing against the clock, trying to refill the empty coffers, before Simone's father, the federal judge, initiated his annual pre-wedding financial audit. If Julian successfully replaced the stolen funds before the accountants scrutinized the ledgers, he could potentially mask the massive withdrawals as a temporary administrative error or a brief reallocation of portfolio assets. It was a desperate attempt to cover his tracks and avoid a lengthy federal prison sentence. But the entire house of cards relied completely on my submission. If I refused to sign over my grandfather's property, Julian would have absolutely no collateral to secure the loan. The church accounts would remain entirely empty. The bishop's audit would expose the devastating missing millions, and my brother would be indicted for grand larceny and wire fraud before he could even put a ring on Simone's finger. My parents knew the stakes. They knew their golden child was staring down decades in a federal penitentiary. That was why they were willing to destroy my public relations agency and scorch my professional reputation. They were not merely protecting his inflated ego, they were fighting to keep him out of a jail cell. Their survival depended entirely on breaking my spirit, but I was unbreakable. I had them. I had them. By Wednesday morning, the silence from my end proved too heavy for my parents to bear. Assuming I was taking too long to surrender, Richard and Vivica launched their promised attack. I was reviewing the final encryption logs when my secure office line began to flash with rapid urgency. The first call came from the chief of staff for a prominent senator, one of my most lucrative and demanding clients. His voice was tight with suppressed panic as he informed me that his office had just received an anonymous, highly disturbing email regarding my agency. Before I could even finish reassuring him, my secondary line lit up. It was the chief executive officer of a major pharmaceutical firm, another cornerstone of my portfolio. He forwarded me a nearly identical message. I opened the attachments and read the defamatory drivel my father had concocted. The emails were vicious, poorly formatted, and dripping with malicious intent. They contained wildly fabricated claims about my crisis management firm, alleging that I secretly recorded confidential client consultations and sold sensitive opposition research to the highest bidder. The anonymous sender claimed to be a disgruntled former employee, acting as a whistleblower to protect Washington's political elite from my supposed unethical behavior. The campaign was designed to strike directly at the core of my business model, which relied entirely on absolute discretion and ironclad trust. Richard was attempting to trigger a mass exodus of my clientele, hoping the sudden threat of exposure would send me spiraling into panic. He wanted me to watch my empire crumble in real time, forcing me to crawl back to the country club and sign over my grandfather's commercial property just to stop the bleeding. He believed his powerful fraternity connections and high society network gave his anonymous whispers enough weight to destroy a decade of my grueling work. The sheer audacity of his strategy was staggering, but his execution was embarrassingly amateurish. I did not panic. I did not scramble to delete the emails or beg my clients to stay. Instead, I leaned back in my leather chair, meticulously analyzing the poorly constructed smear campaign. I recognized my father's bombastic vocabulary hidden behind the anonymous facade. He had used terms like moral bankruptcy and social liability phrases he frequently threw at me during our private arguments. He was acting out of pure, unadulterated desperation, lashing out like a cornered animal because the ticking clock of the federal audit was driving him insane. He thought he was watching me drown, completely oblivious to the fact that I was already charting the exact coordinates of his impending destruction. He assumed I would immediately call him crying and begging for mercy, willing to trade my hard-earned assets for his silence. I let the office phone continue to ring, listening to the chime of incoming emails as the smear campaign slowly filtered through the capital's power brokers. My father was playing a dangerous game with my livelihood, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the resilience of the woman he was trying to break. While Richard was busy attempting to dismantle my professional reputation, Vivica orchestrated a massive synchronized gaslighting campaign on the personal front. My personal cell phone began to vibrate relentlessly, flooded with notifications from the extended family group chats. My mother had deployed her favorite weapon, which was weaponized social pressure, wrapped in the guise of Christian concern. She had spun a masterful, completely fabricated narrative for the benefit of our aunts, uncles, and distant cousins. According to her tearful posts, I was a jealous, bitter sister who was actively trying to ruin Julian's beautiful union out of pure, unwed spite. She painted Julian as a stressed, hard-working groom who just wanted his family united, while casting me as the wicked, estranged daughter, demanding unreasonable attention. The extended family, deeply entrenched in the same toxic culture of appearances and elite society optics, swallowed the lie without a single moment of hesitation. The messages poured in, each one a masterclass in emotional manipulation. My Aunt Patricia sent a long, rambling paragraph about how blood is thicker than water, lecturing me on the importance of family loyalty, and warning me not to embarrass our lineage in front of a federal judge. Uncle Thomas left a condescending voicemail telling me I needed to humble myself, pray on my bitterness, and support my brother financially because God blesses a cheerful giver. Distant cousins I had not spoken to in years suddenly felt entitled to bombard me with guilt-tripping texts accusing me of harboring deep-seated resentment because Julian was marrying into a prominent megachurch dynasty while I remained entirely alone. Vivica had effectively mobilized an army of flying monkeys to relentlessly harass me, creating an echo chamber of relentless judgment. She knew how much I used to crave the family's validation, and she was weaponizing that old vulnerability to break my spirit. The psychological assault was coordinated to hit simultaneously, with the professional sabotage creating a two-pronged attack designed to leave me breathless and submissive. I read the messages scrolling across my screen with absolute clinical detachment. Years ago, this coordinated rejection would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-doubt. I would have drafted endless apologies, desperately trying to explain my side of the story to relatives who were already committed to misunderstanding me. But today, viewing their vitriol through the lens of Julian's impending federal indictment, their aggressive self-righteousness was actually hilarious. They were fiercely defending a man who had stolen millions from a charity, demanding I hand over my wealth to cover up a felony, all while claiming the moral high ground. I did not block them, and I did not mute the chat. I wanted a pristine, unedited record of every single relative who actively participated in my attempted extortion. I let their digital harassment pile up, a monument to their own hypocrisy. My mother thought she was isolating me, but she was merely clarifying exactly who needed to be permanently excised from my life once the dust settled. Their blind loyalty to the golden child was sealing their own social doom. As a master of crisis public relations, I crushed their pathetic smear campaign effortlessly. I immediately directed my elite cybersecurity team to intercept the digital headers of the anonymous defamatory emails. My father had masked his identity using a cheap, commercially available encrypted proxy service, the kind of basic software a teenager uses to bypass a school firewall. It took my intelligence team less than 12 minutes to strip away the proxy layers and trace the exact origin of the transmission. The IP addresses linked directly back to the private secure router located inside my father's lavish Potomac estate. He had literally committed digital defamation from his own mahogany study. I secured the forensic routing logs, capturing irrefutable proof of his cyber harassment. Armed with the digital receipts, I immediately initiated secure one-on-one video conferences with my VIP clients. I did not act defensive and I did not panic. I simply deployed the exact crisis management strategies they paid me millions of dollars to execute. I shared my screen, walking the senator's chief of staff and the pharmaceutical CEO through the cyber trace. I framed the situation as a targeted, desperate corporate espionage attack orchestrated by a rival political faction attempting to breach our secure networks. I showed them the swift, aggressive containment protocols my agency had instantly activated, proving that their confidential data remained completely impenetrable. By confronting the issue with absolute transparency and showcasing my firm's terrifyingly efficient cybersecurity capabilities, I completely neutralized the threat. Rather than losing their trust, my clients were deeply impressed by my immediate and ruthless handling of the situation. Their loyalty to my agency solidified, completely immunizing my business against my father's reckless sabotage. I had secured my empire, ensuring that not a single contract was canceled and not a single dollar of revenue was lost. However, the most crucial element of my strategy was absolute silence. I needed my parents to believe their pressure tactics were working flawlessly. I allowed my father to sit in his study, eagerly refreshing his inbox, entirely convinced that my silence was the direct result of a total professional collapse. I wanted Vivica to look at my unread receipts in the family group chat and smile thoroughly, believing that her orchestrated social isolation had broken my resolve. They thought I was currently scrambling in my office, desperately trying to salvage my ruined agency, weeping over my alienated family, and preparing to surrender my commercial property, just to make the pain stop. By letting them believe they had won, I ensured they would not look for alternative ways to fund Julian's massive embezzled debt. They were putting all their eggs into my basket, completely unaware that the basket was rigged with explosives. I sat quietly in my high-rise office, smiling at the Washington skyline, waiting patiently for Friday to arrive. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy downpour, matching the somber mood I needed to project. I picked up my phone and dialed Julian's private number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and defensive, betraying his underlying panic. I kept my tone flat, letting a slight manufactured tremor seep into my voice. I told him I was ready. I said the pressure was destroying my business, and I could not fight them anymore. The immediate shift in his demeanor was palpable. The frantic edge vanished, replaced instantly by the smug, arrogant drawl of the golden child who believed he had just conquered his biggest obstacle. He dictated the terms of our meeting with absolute authority, instructing me to meet him and our parents at the Hamilton Club, an ultra-exclusive members-only cigar lounge in downtown Washington. It was Richard's favorite sanctuary, a dark wood-paneled fortress where the city's power brokers made backdoor deals through clouds of expensive smoke. Julian wanted to finalize the extortion on his home turf, surrounded by the trappings of old money and untouchable privilege. I agreed meekly, promising to bring the commercial property deed and the necessary transfer documents. I hung up the phone and allowed myself a brief, genuine smile. The bait was set, and the predators were circling, completely unaware that they were walking into a meticulously laid trap. I spent the next hour preparing my costume for the evening. I needed to look like a woman whose entire world had just collapsed. I deliberately skipped my usual flawless makeup routine, leaving the dark circles under my eyes visible. I chose a high-end but slightly wrinkled trench coat and pulled my hair back into a severe, unstyled knot. I practiced my posture in the mirror, letting my shoulders slump and my gaze drop, stripping away the formidable aura of a crisis management CEO until only the beaten, marginalized scapegoat remained. The final piece of my preparation was the most crucial. I opened a concealed wall safe and retrieved a military-grade micro-digital recording device, the exact model my intelligence operatives used for high-level corporate espionage. It was impossibly small, completely undetectable, and designed to capture crystal-clear audio through thick fabrics and background noise. I secured the device deep inside the lining of my designer handbag, activating the continuous recording feature. Every threat, every admission, and every piece of blackmail would be immortalized in high-definition audio. I grabbed the folder containing the property deeds and headed out into the rain. The drive through the slick, rain-soaked streets of the capital gave me time to perfect my mental state. I needed them to feel completely powerful. The more powerful they felt, the more careless they would become. I pulled up to the valet stand at the Hamilton Club, handing over my keys with a practiced look of sheer exhaustion. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors, breathing in the overwhelming scent of aged leather and imported tobacco, ready to play the game of my life. I found them seated in a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the back of the lounge. Richard was puffing on a thick Cuban cigar, looking incredibly relaxed for a man on the brink of federal indictment. Vivica sat beside him, sipping a dark red vintage, radiating a toxic, triumphant energy. Julian sat across from them, tapping his fingers impatiently on the polished table. When they saw me approach, their collective posture shifted into a unified front of absolute superiority. I pulled out a heavy leather chair and sank into it, letting out a ragged, defeated sigh. I placed my handbag carefully on the table, ensuring the hidden microphone had an unobstructed auditory path to all three of them. I did not order a drink. I simply looked down at my hands, playing the role of the utterly vanquished daughter. Vivica leaned forward, a predatory gleam in her eyes. She asked if I had finally learned my lesson about family loyalty. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the table. I told them their campaign had worked perfectly. I admitted that my clients were panicking and my agency was bleeding reputation by the hour. I fed them exactly what they desperately wanted to hear. I stroked their massive egos, telling Richard that his influence in the capital was far too vast for me to fight. I praised Julian, calling him the true heir to the family legacy, and admitted that I was foolish to ever think I could stand against them. The flattery acted like pure oxygen to a fire. Richard leaned back, exhaling a thick plume of smoke, a sinister grin spreading across his face. He told me that power in this city was not about who worked the hardest, but about who held the right cards. Julian, emboldened by my complete submission, eagerly took the bait. He leaned across the table, his eyes wide with frantic greed. He asked if I brought the deed. I slowly produced the legal folder and placed it on the table, keeping my hand firmly over the documents. I looked up, letting a tear pool in my eye, and asked Julian why they needed this specific building so desperately. I begged them to explain why they had to destroy my life over a simple wedding bill. I played the confused, desperate victim seeking closure. I asked Julian how a financial genius like him could possibly need my grandfather's old commercial space. The stroke to his ego proved fatal. Julian could not resist the urge to boast about his supposed intellect. He scoffed, claiming that my small mind could never comprehend high-level financial maneuvering. He wanted to prove that his reckless actions were actually brilliant strategic plays. He lowered his voice, leaning intimately close to my hidden recording device, and began to explain his grand design. He wanted to show off how he had manipulated the system. He wanted to revel in his own twisted brilliance. He wanted to rub my face in the fact that he was untouchable. He began to outline his entire scheme, completely oblivious to the fact that he was narrating his own federal indictment. My mother smiled proudly, sipping her wine, watching her golden boy dig his own grave. My father nodded in agreement, fully endorsing the criminal conspiracy. I sat in silence, absorbing every single word, ensuring the microphone captured the absolute totality of their hubris. I just needed to keep him talking. Hubris took complete control of the conversation. Julian arrogantly explained that the cryptocurrency crash was just a temporary market correction, but he needed immediate liquidity to manage the family trust. He explicitly stated that he had borrowed $2.5 million from his future father-in-law's church charity fund. He used the word borrowed, but his tone dripped with contempt for the congregation he had defrauded. He detailed exactly how he bypassed the megachurch's administrative protocols, using Simone's security clearance, bragging about his ability to outsmart a federal judge. He confessed that the upcoming pre-wedding audit would expose the missing capital, which was why he needed my commercial property deed. He planned to use it as collateral for an off-the-books bridge loan to quietly refund the charity before anyone noticed. I turned my gaze to my father, asking him directly if he knew about this stolen church money. Richard laughed a cold, ruthless sound. He confirmed that he knew everything. He openly admitted that threatening my public relations firm and launching the smear campaign was a necessary tactic to secure the collateral they needed to cover Julian's federal crime. Richard boldly stated that sacrificing my business was a small price to pay to keep his son out of prison and maintain the family's immaculate social standing. He literally outlined the parameters of their blackmail scheme, confirming their criminal conspiracy on a high-definition digital recording. Vivica chimed in, telling me I should feel honored to help save the family name from a federal scandal. They all laughed together, a chorus of morally bankrupt narcissists clinking their glasses in victory. They genuinely believed they had broken my spirit and forced my compliance through sheer intimidation. They thought I was surrendering my grandfather's legacy to protect a thief. I slowly removed my hand from the legal folder, sliding the transfer documents toward Julian. I kept my expression perfectly defeated, masking the absolute triumph surging through my veins. The trap was fully loaded, and they had just handed me the detonator. I had their full confessions captured flawlessly on tape. Julian practically shoved the leather-bound folder across the polished mahogany table. His eyes were gleaming with undisguised greed as his fingers tapped impatiently against the brass hinges. I pulled the folder toward me and opened it slowly. I let my eyes trace over the printed pages, projecting the image of a defeated woman stalling for time. In reality, my crisis management instincts were tearing the documents apart line by line. I almost laughed out loud at the sheer incompetence staring back at me. I was accustomed to reviewing airtight, bulletproof contracts drafted by the most expensive corporate attorneys in Washington. The paperwork sitting in front of me was a catastrophic joke. It was immediately obvious that Julian could not afford to retain his usual white shoe law firm because his accounts were completely drained. Instead, he had clearly scrambled to find a discount strip mall attorney to draft the transfer deeds on a severe budget. The paper quality was cheap, lacking the heavy, textured watermark of a legitimate corporate firm. The formatting was entirely inconsistent, with misaligned margins and boilerplate language that looked like it had been downloaded straight from a free legal template website. I read through the clauses, meticulously noting every glaring amateur mistake. Julian's bargain bin lawyers had failed to include standard hold harmless provisions. They completely omitted the necessary indemnification clauses that would legally protect the recipient from existing property liabilities. There were even glaring typographical errors in the property description and the parcel identification numbers. A first-year law student would have spotted these liabilities in seconds. It was a glaring testament to Julian's staggering ineptitude and Richard's blind desperation. They were attempting to cover up a multi-million-dollar federal crime involving a prominent megachurch charity, and they were trying to execute the cover-up using documents that looked like they belonged in a small claims court dispute. I took my time turning each page. I let the silence stretch, deliberately amplifying their anxiety. I wanted to make them sweat. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, the leather squeaking loudly in the quiet alcove. He wiped a small bead of sweat from his forehead, his arrogant facade cracking just slightly under the pressure of the delay. My father puffed aggressively on his cigar, the thick smoke curling around his face as he glared at me. My mother gripped the stem of her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. They were absolutely terrified that I might find a loophole or suddenly change my mind and walk away. I kept my face devoid of emotion, reading paragraph after poorly constructed paragraph. I was silently mocking their entire existence. They believed they were the apex predators of the capital, the untouchable elite who pulled the strings of society. Yet here they were, banking their entire freedom on a stack of legally deficient papers drafted by a cut-rate attorney. They were so blinded by their own hubris and their desperate need to secure the collateral that they did not even bother to properly review the documents they were forcing me to sign. Their sheer incompetence was staggering, but it worked perfectly in my favor. I did not point out a single error. I did not correct their typos or demand better terms. I simply let them bask in their own foolishness, knowing that their sloppy legal work was just the appetizer for the absolute devastation I was about to serve them. What Julian and Richard did not know, and what they had been far too arrogant to investigate, was the precise structural integrity of the trust my grandfather had established. My grandfather was a brilliant, self-made titan of real estate, who understood the malicious nature of the people sharing his bloodline. He had watched Richard turn into a superficial social climber, and he had seen Julian develop into a spoiled, reckless liability. When he bequeathed the commercial building to me, he knew perfectly well that the day would eventually come when my family would try to seize it. They would view my independence as a threat, and my assets as a communal piggy bank. To ensure my permanent protection, my grandfather had his elite legal team weave a highly classified poison pill clause deep into the foundational charter of the limited liability company that held the property deed. It was an irrevocable, heavily shielded failsafe designed specifically to prevent familial financial abuse and extortion. The mechanism was incredibly complex, but flawlessly effective. The clause dictated that any forced, sudden, or irregular transfer of the commercial deed executed outside of a standard fiscal quarter review or lacking a mandatory 90-day escrow holding period would automatically trigger a severe compliance breach. This was not a simple alert sent to a local bank manager. The poison pill was digitally integrated with federal financial monitoring systems. The moment the transfer deed was signed, notarized, and filed with the city clerk, the trust would automatically generate an emergency red flag audit report. This highly detailed report would be routed instantaneously and directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. The automated federal alert was coded to flag the transaction for suspected money laundering, coercion, and elder or beneficiary extortion. Within 48 hours of Julian filing the paperwork to claim his prize, federal auditors would receive a complete unredacted brief of the suspicious asset transfer. The immediate federal response would be to place a hard, impenetrable freeze on the commercial property, rendering it absolutely useless as collateral for any type of bridge loan. More importantly, the red flag would legally compel the authorities to initiate a comprehensive forensic audit of the recipient's entire financial portfolio to ensure they were not laundering stolen capital. Julian believed he was securing a massive unencumbered asset to save himself from prison. He had absolutely no idea that he was actually swallowing a tracking device. He was willingly chaining himself to an automated distress beacon that would summon federal investigators directly to his zeroed-out offshore accounts and his falsified church charity ledgers. Because he had never respected my grandfather's intellect, and because he had used a discount attorney who did not bother to read the foundational bylaws of the trust, Julian was walking blindly into a legal slaughterhouse. The poison pill was armed perfectly concealed within the very asset they were trying to steal. I finished reviewing the final page of the transfer agreement. I reached across the table and picked up the heavy brass pen Julian had thoughtfully provided for my surrender. The weight of the metal felt cold and substantial in my hand. I looked up at the three of them one last time. Julian was practically vibrating with greedy anticipation, his eyes locked onto the tip of the pen. Vivica offered a smug, victorious smile, clearly believing she had successfully broken her disobedient daughter. Richard leaned back, exhaling a final triumphant cloud of cigar smoke, entirely convinced he had saved the family empire through sheer intimidation. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist. I lowered my hand to the paper. I did not hesitate. My hand did not shake. My hand, and my breathing remained perfectly steady. I signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, deliberate strokes. I flipped to the next page and initialed the margins, executing each signature with the practiced grace of a woman who knew exactly how the game was won. Every stroke of the pen was another nail hammered securely into their federal coffins. I closed the leather folder and pushed it slowly across the polished mahogany table. Julian did not even wait for it to stop moving. He snatched the folder up immediately, clutching it to his chest like a starving man grabbing a piece of bread. The relief washing over his face was pathetic. He let out a loud, breathless laugh, looking at my father as if they had just pulled off the heist of the century. I stood up from my chair, keeping my head slightly bowed, maintaining the illusion of the completely vanquished scapegoat until the bitter end. I grabbed my designer handbag, feeling the solid weight of the hidden recording device inside, capturing their joyful, incriminating celebrations. I told them I would see them at the wedding, my voice dropping to a soft, defeated whisper. Julian dismissed me with a wave of his hand, already opening his phone to text his cheap lawyers to file the paperwork first thing in the morning. I turned my back to them and walked out of the dimly lit cigar lounge. As I stepped out into the pouring Washington rain, a genuine, terrifying smile spread across my face. The paperwork was signed, the poison pill was swallowed, the ticking time bomb was officially activated. The trap had snapped entirely shut. Thursday morning arrived with crisp, unclouded skies over Washington. Inside my penthouse apartment, the silence was broken by the sharp, persistent vibration of my personal cell phone resting on the marble nightstand. I reached out and picked it up, already knowing who was aggressively demanding my attention before 7 in the morning. The screen illuminated with a barrage of text messages from Vivica. She was currently in Atlanta orchestrating Julian's lavish wedding rehearsal, and she had clearly designated this morning to ensure her scapegoat daughter was properly leashed. I opened the message thread and read her rapid-fire commands. She dictated my exact flight itinerary, ordering me to land in Georgia by noon, and explicitly instructing me to be seated at the rehearsal dinner by 6 o'clock sharp. She added a stern warning not to embarrass the family with any displays of independence. Attached to the final text was a high-resolution photograph of the garment I was mandated to wear for the main event on Friday. I tapped the image, allowing it to fill my screen, and I actually let out a genuine musical laugh. The dress was a breathtaking insult. It was a drab, slate-gray, shapeless monstrosity constructed of stiff, unflattering fabric. It had a high, suffocating neckline and a hem that hit awkwardly below the knee. It looked less like a bridesmaid gown and more like a uniform designed for a 19th century prison inmate. It was the physical manifestation of my mother's desire to erase me, a sartorial gag order meant to blend me into the background wallpaper of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. I did not reply to her messages. I did not argue, and I certainly did not pack the hideous garment she had previously shipped to my concierge. Instead, I walked over to my walk-in closet, pulled the gray dress from its plastic dry cleaning bag, and dropped it unceremoniously into the trash bin. It landed with a dull thud exactly where my family's expectations belonged. I then pulled out my matching set of classic Louis Vuitton luggage and began to pack for a completely different climate. I bypassed the conservative, muted business suits I normally wore in the capital. Instead, I selected vibrant, luxurious resort wear. I packed flowing silk cover-ups, wide-brimmed sun hats, and designer sunglasses meant for the glaring Pacific sun. My wardrobe reflected the absolute freedom I had finally secured. I zipped the leather bags shut, my movements brisk and energized. I left the penthouse and took my private elevator down to the waiting black SUV that would transport me to Dulles International Airport. I was not flying to Atlanta to sit in the shadows of my brother's fraudulent wedding. I had booked a direct first-class ticket to Los Angeles, California. I settled into the plush leather seat of the airport transfer vehicle, watching the monuments of Washington blur past the tinted windows. My parents believed they had successfully bullied me into submission, expecting me to arrive in the South with a bowed head and a broken spirit. They were actively finalizing seating charts, ensuring my gray dress was tucked securely behind a structural pillar near the catering doors. They were totally oblivious to the fact that their designated victim was currently sipping sparkling water in an exclusive airport lounge preparing to fly 3,000 miles in the exact opposite direction. I boarded the flight, sinking into my spacious first-class pod. The flight attendant offered me a warm towel and a glass of vintage champagne. I accepted both, toasting silently to the incredible stupidity of my brother and the blind arrogance of my parents. As the plane taxied down the runway, I reclined my seat and prepared for a deeply relaxing journey, leaving the toxic swamp of my family's creation entirely behind me. Before I had left my penthouse for the airport, I spent the early hours of the morning meticulously preparing my official wedding gift for the golden couple. As a crisis public relations expert, I knew that the delivery mechanism of a scandal was just as crucial as the scandal itself. The presentation had to be flawless, irresistible, and engineered to exploit their insatiable greed. I selected a sleek, heavy black velvet box, the kind typically used to house million-dollar luxury timepieces or priceless diamond necklaces. It was lined with pristine white satin and secured with a polished silver clasp. It screamed generational wealth, practically guaranteeing that Julian would tear it open the second it was placed in front of him. But the box did not contain cash, bearer bonds, or the property deeds he so desperately craved. Nestled perfectly into the custom-molded satin insert was a brand-new top-of-the-line iPad. I had directed my elite cybersecurity team to completely wipe the device and rebuild its operating system from the ground up. They had installed a custom-programmed interface locked behind a military-grade firewall, rendering the tablet impossible to shut down, mute, or bypass once it was activated. The screen was configured to display a simple, elegant countdown timer, building anticipation while masking the digital executioner hiding beneath the code. The true genius of the gift, however, lay hidden beneath the tablet. I had hardwired a high-range, industrial-strength Bluetooth audio override transmitter directly into the iPad's battery matrix. This was not a standard consumer gadget. It was a piece of tactical hardware designed to aggressively scan, isolate, and hijack any commercial audio-visual system within a 500-foot radius. The Ritz-Carlton Buckhead boasted a massive, state-of-the-art sound system and giant high-definition projector screens for their luxury ballroom events. My transmitter was pre-programmed with the specific frequency bands used by the hotel's event staff. The moment Julian opened the velvet box and the light sensor triggered the iPad to wake, the transmitter would instantly forcefully pair with the ballroom's master receivers. It would mercilessly kick the wedding band's microphones and the DJ's equipment off the network, seizing absolute control of every single speaker and projector screen in the venue. Loaded onto the tablet's encrypted hard drive was the crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording from the cigar lounge. Right alongside it were the unredacted ledgers from the Atlanta megachurch, the Securities and Exchange Commission freeze orders, and the automated federal audit alerts triggered by the poison pill I had signed. I polished the glass screen of the tablet until it gleamed, ensuring not a single fingerprint marred its surface. I closed the heavy lid of the black velvet box, hearing the satisfying click of the silver clasp snapping into place. I had packaged my brother's federal indictment into a perfect, elegant wedding present, ready to be detonated at the height of his social triumph. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and technological precision designed to deliver absolute devastation with zero chance of technical failure. With the velvet box prepared and sealed, I had placed a call to a highly specialized elite secure courier service that my agency routinely used for handling sensitive government documents. The bonded courier arrived at my penthouse precisely on schedule, dressed in a sharp black suit and carrying a biometric lockbox. I handed over the velvet package with explicit non-negotiable instructions. The package was to be flown on a private charter directly to Atlanta, Georgia. Under no circumstances was it to be handed to a receptionist, a wedding planner, or a hotel concierge. The courier was mandated to walk directly into the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Buckhead and place the box firmly on the head table. I specified the exact delivery window. The package had to arrive perfectly timed to coincide with the best man's evening toast, the exact moment when the room would be quiet, the guests would be seated, and Julian's ego would be at its absolute zenith. I attached a thick, cream-colored card to the lid, embossed with elegant gold lettering. The card read, "Strictly for Julian to be opened immediately during the toast." I paid the courier an exorbitant premium to ensure flawless execution, watching him secure the box in his biometric case before leaving my apartment. My vengeance was now airborne entirely out of my hands and hurtling toward Atlanta like a guided missile. Hours later, the wheels of my first-class flight touched down smoothly on the sun-baked tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport. I bypassed the crowded baggage claims, retrieving my Louis Vuitton luggage with the help of a private concierge, and stepped out into the glorious golden California afternoon. A sleek, black luxury town car was already idling at the curb, waiting to transport me to my final destination. The drive up the Pacific Coast Highway was spectacular, the winding roads offering breathtaking views of the vast sparkling ocean. We pulled up to a stunning, ultra-private cliffside villa in Malibu, completely isolated from the chaos of the world. I unlocked the heavy glass doors and walked directly out onto the expansive wooden balcony. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the warm, salty ocean breeze wash over my face. The crashing of the waves below provided a steady, peaceful rhythm. 3,000 miles away, a storm of apocalyptic proportions was gathering over my family's fabricated empire, but here on the California coast, I had never felt more completely untouchable. Friday morning dawned bright in Atlanta. Inside a discreet wood-paneled office of a private financial firm, Julian sat across from a high-risk shadow lender. He handed over the signed transfer deed with the arrogant flourish of a man who believed he had just cheated destiny. He expected an immediate wire transfer of $2.5 million to cover his federal tracks. The lender, a ruthless man who operated strictly on verified collateral, slid the documents across his desk and initiated the digital verification process. He typed the parcel identification numbers into the Federal Commercial Registry to secure the lien. Julian leaned back in his chair. He was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic chain reaction occurring within the mainframe. The moment the shadow lender submitted the deed for transfer protocol, the poison pill embedded in my grandfather's trust activated. It did not send a warning. It executed a hard, impenetrable federal lock. The lender's monitor flashed with a severe compliance breach notification. He frowned, tapping his keyboard, attempting to override what he assumed was a simple bureaucratic glitch. Instead, his screen locked, completely displaying a mandatory Securities and Exchange Commission audit alert. The lender looked up at Julian, his previous professional courtesy replaced by a cold, calculating suspicion. He informed my brother that the asset was completely frozen under suspicion of elder financial abuse and money laundering. He slid the useless deed back across the desk and ordered Julian out of his office immediately, refusing to associate his firm with a glaring federal red flag. Julian stumbled out into the oppressive Georgia heat, his heart hammering against his ribs. Panic began to claw at the edges of his perfectly curated facade. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and frantically logged into his personal and offshore banking portals. He needed to find a way to shift capital to find any remaining liquidity to stall the bishop's impending audit. He typed in his passwords, his breath catching in his throat. The screen loaded, but the balances did not appear. Instead, a stark, terrifying message blocked his access. His profiles were suspended. The automated systems of the Internal Revenue Service had synchronized with the SEC alert. Within a matter of hours, federal algorithms had traced Julian's name across the banking grid and executed a total uncompromising freeze on every single account tied to his social security number. He was completely locked out. He had no access to cash, no access to credit, and absolutely no way to refund the millions he had stolen from the mega church charity fund. The Golden Child stood on the bustling streets of Atlanta, reduced to a penniless federal suspect. He was completely trapped. He stared blankly at his useless glowing phone screen, the reality of his impending prosecution finally crashing down upon him. His flawless wedding weekend was rapidly transforming into an unavoidable criminal nightmare. Pure, unadulterated panic ripped through the toxic family ranks like a wildfire. Back in my Malibu villa, my phone began to vibrate violently against the glass patio table. The digital onslaught was relentless. It started with a barrage of frantic, almost incoherent text messages from Julian. He demanded to know what kind of sick trick I had played with the property deed. He typed in all capital letters screaming through the screen, asking why his bank accounts were displaying federal suspension codes. He ordered me to call the trust administrators immediately and lift the restrictions, completely unaware that no lawyer on earth could undo an active federal investigation. When I did not respond to his initial demands, his messages shifted from arrogant commands to desperate, pathetic begging. He pleaded with me to answer the phone, whining that his wedding was going to be ruined and his entire life was falling apart. I watched the notifications stack up, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep, satisfying vindication. Then my mother joined the digital assault. Vivica realized I had not shown up for the mandated wedding rehearsal at the hotel. She called my cell phone 12 times in rapid succession, leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails. Her voice echoed through the speaker of my phone, shrill and dripping with venom. She demanded to know why I was not standing in my designated spot near the kitchen doors. She screamed that I was intentionally embarrassing the family in front of Simone's powerful relatives. She threatened to completely disown me, a hilarious threat, considering I had already severed the relationship myself. She accused me of being a jealous, spiteful spinster who was trying to sabotage her brother out of pure malice. She ordered me to get on the next flight to Atlanta and fix whatever administrative error I had caused with the property transfer. My father, Richard, was the last to attack. His messages were cold, furious, and filled with the impotent rage of a man losing control of his carefully constructed universe. He texted me that his own credit lines were suddenly being questioned by his banks due to his association with Julian's frozen accounts. He commanded me to answer his calls immediately, threatening to unleash his high society lawyers on my public relations firm. He promised to make me regret the day I was born if I did not resolve the financial freeze before the wedding reception tomorrow. He was flailing wildly in the dark, desperately trying to intimidate a woman who was sitting 3,000 miles out of his reach. The sheer volume of their harassment was a testament to their absolute desperation. They were trapped in a luxurious hotel surrounded by hundreds of elite guests, forced to smile and pretend everything was perfect while their financial reality completely disintegrated. They were sweating through their designer clothes, terrified that the bishop would ask for the charity ledgers at any moment. They needed a scapegoat to fix their mess, and their designated scapegoat had vanished entirely. They were isolated in their own nightmare, desperately trying to keep the sinking ship afloat while the water rushed in. I read a message from Julian claiming he was going to be physically sick from the stress. I read a text from Vivica stating that Simone's mother was already asking questions about my mysterious absence. Their perfect society wedding had transformed into a high-stakes hostage situation, and they were the hostages of their own catastrophic greed. The notifications continued to flood my screen, painting a vivid picture of a family tearing itself apart from the inside out. Their relentless attempts to reach me only proved how utterly powerless they truly were without my compliance. I let them suffer in their self-inflicted agony. I sat comfortably on the sun-drenched balcony of my Malibu rental, completely removed from their frantic, suffocating chaos. The warm California sun beat down on my skin, and the rhythmic sound of the crashing Pacific waves provided a perfect soundtrack to my victory. I reached for the crystal glass resting on the table beside me and took a slow, deliberate sip of my chilled cocktail. The citrus and tequila tasted crisp and incredibly refreshing. I watched a flock of seagulls dive toward the ocean, marveling at the absolute tranquility of my surroundings. I was a world away from the humid, panic-stricken hotel rooms of Atlanta. I picked up my phone one final time. The screen was still lighting up with desperate notifications from the family group chat. Julian was threatening to call the police, claiming I had defrauded him. My father was demanding I wire them emergency cash. My mother was simply typing out strings of hysterical profanities. I opened the group chat interface, watching their frantic typing bubbles appear and disappear. I did not write a lengthy explanation. I did not offer a grand, dramatic villain speech detailing how I had orchestrated their downfall. I did not even bother to mention the federal indictments I knew were rapidly approaching their doorstep. I simply tapped the keyboard with a steady, relaxed finger. I typed a single, concise sentence that I knew would drive them absolutely insane with paranoia and fear. Enjoy the wedding. My gift is on the way. I hit send. I watched the delivery notification confirm that all three of them had received and read the message instantly. I did not wait to see their confused, terrified replies. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single second more of my time or attention. I swiped down on my phone screen and firmly tapped the crescent moon icon. The device immediately slipped into Do Not Disturb mode, silencing all calls, blocking all messages, and completely severing their access to me. I tossed the useless piece of technology onto the patio table. I leaned back into my plush lounge chair, adjusted my designer sunglasses against the glaring sun, and closed my eyes. The storm was currently gathering over Atlanta, preparing to unleash absolute devastation upon the people who had tried to bury me. But here on the coast, the sky was perfectly clear, and the silence was absolutely magnificent. Section 10, 1,500 words. 2,000 miles away from my peaceful coastal sanctuary, the grand ballroom of the Buckhead Ritz-Carlton was vibrating with a suffocating level of fabricated opulence. The wedding of Julian and Simone was designed to be the undisputed social event of the decade, a heavy-handed display of wealth, meant to cement two prominent families into Southern royalty. The cavernous space had been transformed into a grotesque wonderland of excess. Thousands of imported white orchids and rare cascading roses draped from the vaulted ceiling, their heavy floral perfume mixing with the scent of expensive designer perfumes and roasted truffles. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, unforgiving light over 50 tables draped in custom-spun silk linens. Massive ice sculptures depicting doves in mid-flight slowly melted at the corners of the room, flanked by towering tiers of imported champagne. Every single detail, from the gold-plated cutlery to the hand-calligraphed menus, screamed of a blank check budget that simply did not exist. The guest list was a meticulously curated roster of the political and social elite of Atlanta and Washington. Mayors, city councilmen, and state senators mingled near the open bars, trading favors and exchanging business cards under the guise of celebration. Prominent members of the elite Black fraternities and sororities held court in their respective corners, evaluating the floral arrangements and judging the catering with practiced, critical eyes. The media was highly present, with local society photographers and lifestyle magazine reporters weaving through the crowd, capturing the flawless smiles of the wealthy and powerful. The atmosphere was incredibly dense, thick with the unspoken rules of high society, where every interaction was a transaction and every smile was a calculated performance. At the center of this suffocating grandeur sat the mega-church elite, the loyal disciples and powerful associates of Simone's father. They occupied the most prominent tables near the front, radiating a terrifying blend of religious authority and immense financial leverage. The bishop himself held court with the quiet, intimidating grace of a federal judge who was accustomed to absolute obedience. He surveyed the ballroom with an eagle eye, mentally calculating the cost of the event, completely certain that the groom's family had matched his own staggering financial contributions dollar for dollar. The sheer scale of the reception was overwhelming, a multi-million-dollar illusion built entirely on a foundation of stolen charity funds and catastrophic debt. The room was packed with 500 of the most influential people in the region, all gathered to witness the crowning achievement of the Golden Child. The music swelled from a 12-piece live orchestra filling the vast space with a triumphant symphony that completely masked the sound of the impending disaster. No one in that room had the slightest inkling that the extravagant celebration they were attending was entirely funded by wire fraud. Waitstaff in pristine white tuxedos glided across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and Wagyu beef tartare. They moved like phantoms, offering miniature crab cakes to the hungry crowd of social climbers. Every bite was paid for by the sweat of unsuspecting charity donors. Julian had treated the church housing fund as his personal cash machine, stealing from the vulnerable to feed the elite. The wealthy guests laughed loudly, their diamond jewelry flashing under the ambient lighting, completely unaware that their extravagant dinner was actively serving as the scene of a massive federal crime. The sheer volume of the celebration pressed down on the room, making the air feel thin and unbreathable for anyone who actually knew the catastrophic secret hiding just beneath the surface. Seated at the prestigious parents' table just below the raised bridal dais, Vivica and Richard were experiencing a private waking nightmare. Underneath their meticulously tailored designer clothes, they were sweating profusely. My father tugged uncomfortably at the collar of his custom tuxedo, his face flushed and his heart pounding with an erratic, terrifying rhythm. He kept wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief, blaming the intense heat of the camera flashes, though the ballroom was heavily air-conditioned. Every time a waiter dropped a plate or a glass clinked nearby, he flinched, half expecting a team of federal agents to burst through the mahogany doors. My mother sat frozen beside him, her spine rigidly straight, gripping her crystal champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She wore a stunning emerald evening gown, but her skin carried a sickly ashen undertone. She forced her lips into a wide, painful, and entirely fake smile, nodding mechanically at the passing dignitaries and wealthy socialites. Behind her painted eyes, absolute financial terror was consuming her alive. She knew Julian's bank accounts were entirely frozen. She knew the bridge loan had failed. She knew that Simone's father could demand to see the church charity ledgers the moment the weekend concluded. Her mind was frantically calculating how long they had before the federal auditors knocked on their door. She kept glancing at her phone hidden in her sequined clutch, desperately praying for a message from me confirming that the commercial property had somehow cleared the federal block. In stark contrast to my parents' suffocating dread, Simone looked utterly triumphant. Positioned at the center of the head table, the bride was basking in her perceived victory. She wore a breathtaking custom couture gown covered in thousands of hand-sewn pearls, looking down at the massive crowd with the haughty arrogance of a newly crowned queen. She believed she had secured the ultimate prize, marrying into a wealthy, established Washington family, completely unaware that she had just legally bound herself to a penniless federal suspect. She smiled radiantly for the flashing cameras leaning in to whisper private jokes to Julian, totally oblivious to the sweat gathering on his forehead. At one point, she leaned over the edge of the dais and patronizingly asked my mother why my seat at the back table remained empty. Vivica swallowed hard, her fake smile trembling as she smoothly lied, claiming I had encountered a severe last-minute crisis at my public relations firm and was devastated to miss the celebration. Simone simply let out a dismissive, arrogant little laugh, telling my mother it was probably for the best, as my dull aesthetic would have ruined the professional photographs anyway. My mother nodded in eager agreement, swallowing her pride, desperately trying to keep the bride happy, while her own world actively burned to the ground. Vivica took another large gulp of her champagne, her stomach churning violently as the terrible weight of their impending ruin settled heavily upon her shoulders. The extravagant reception was in full swing, reaching the pinnacle of the evening's scheduled festivities. The massive ballroom doors swung open, but it was not the catering staff bringing out the next course. A man in a sharp tactical black suit walked into the venue carrying a biometric security briefcase. He bypassed the frantic wedding planners, ignoring their hushed demands to stop
and marched with absolute purpose directly toward the raised head table. The courier's boots clicked loudly against the polished marble floor, creating a rhythmic, ominous sound that momentarily overpowered the soft jazz playing from the orchestra pit. The guests parted for him automatically, sensing the severe, unyielding authority radiating from his posture. When he reached his destination, the solid thud of his heavy boots drew every single eye in the room to the mysterious package he carried. The sudden appearance of the secure courier caused a ripple of curious whispers among the elite guests seated near the center aisle. The best man had just stood up, tapping his crystal glass with a silver fork to command the room's attention for the traditional evening toast. The courier ignored the best man entirely. He stepped up to the head table, locked eyes with Julian, and placed a sleek, heavy black velvet box directly in front of him. The courier requested a digital signature, retrieved his biometric case, and marched right back out of the ballroom without uttering a single word of explanation. Julian stared at the black velvet box, his eyes widening with a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. The box was secured with a polished silver clasp and bore a thick cream-colored card with elegant gold lettering that clearly stated it was a gift from me. His breathing hitched. His panic-clouded brain immediately jumped to the most convenient, greedy conclusion possible. He assumed my final text message from Malibu was a white flag of complete surrender. He convinced himself that I had somehow managed to bypass the federal red flag on the property deed. Or better yet, that I had simply liquidated my own business assets to save him from ruin. He stared at the heavy velvet package, absolutely certain that I had caved to their vicious extortion and sent the required $150,000 in high-denomination bearer bonds, liquid cash, or certified cashier checks to rescue him from federal prison. A massive, arrogant grin broke across his sweating face. He greedily pulled the box toward his chest, his hands actually shaking with desperate anticipation, ready to claim his salvation in front of his new, powerful family. He did not even bother to read the elegant card properly. He was consumed by the blinding relief of a desperate man who believed he had just narrowly escaped the gallows. He was completely blind to the bomb he was about to detonate. The best man, a slick fraternity brother with a blinding smile, stood at the podium wrapping up a speech entirely devoid of truth. He raised his crystal flute toward the ceiling, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom sound system. He spoke passionately about Julian's unmatched integrity and unwavering honor. He spun a fabricated narrative about a man who always put his community first, a dedicated leader who represented the absolute pinnacle of their elite social circle. The crowd of 500 powerful guests erupted into thunderous applause, completely charmed by the charismatic delivery. Simone's father, the federal judge and bishop, nodded in stern approval from his prominent seat, fully convinced he was welcoming a paragon of virtue into his sacred dynasty. Julian soaked in the adulation like a sponge, his chest puffing out beneath his tailored tuxedo. The arrival of the heavy velvet box had completely erased the suffocating terror he had been experiencing just moments prior. He firmly believed my delivery contained the exact financial salvation he desperately needed to cover his multi-million-dollar federal crime. He felt invincible. As the applause began to fade, Julian saw an opportunity to amplify his own glory. He stood up from his velvet-draped chair, picking up his champagne flute and a silver fork. He tapped the metal against the crystal, producing a sharp, clear, ringing sound that instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. The guests quieted down, turning their expectant faces toward the groom. Julian reached over and pulled the microphone from the best man's hands, adopting an expression of profound, magnanimous grace. He looked out over the sea of politicians, socialites, and religious leaders, projecting the image of a deeply forgiving and loving family man. He thanked his best man for the touching words and then dramatically lowered his voice to a tone of manufactured sorrow. He announced that while the evening was perfect, there was one person whose absence weighed heavily on his heart. He named me his estranged sister, weaving a tragic tale about how my demanding crisis management career had tragically kept me away from the most important night of his life. A murmur of sympathetic understanding rippled through the elite crowd. Julian then placed his hand reverently on the black velvet box resting on the table.
He declared that despite the physical distance, our family bond remained absolutely unbreakable. He told the audience that I had sent a special, highly anticipated wedding gift via secure courier to ensure I was part of the celebration. He proudly announced that he wanted to open this token of my affection right here in front of everyone to honor our supposedly enduring sibling connection. My mother Vivica smiled tightly from her seat, internally praying that the box contained the liquid assets required to save them from ruin. My father Richard leaned forward with bated breath. They were eagerly anticipating a public display of my total submission, completely unaware of the looming catastrophe. Julian confidently reached for the polished silver clasp securing the black velvet box, his fingers trembling ever so slightly with greedy anticipation. He flicked the latch open and smoothly lifted the heavy lid, fully expecting to see stacks of certified cashier checks, high-denomination bearer bonds, or the unencumbered deed to my commercial property. Instead, his eager smile froze, instantly shattering into a mask of profound confusion. There was absolutely no money inside the container. The pristine white satin interior held nothing but a sleek dark iPad resting silently in a custom-molded groove. Julian stared at the device, his mind struggling to process the visual information. He frantically dug his fingers under the tablet, tearing at the satin lining, desperately searching for a hidden envelope or a folded legal document tucked beneath the hardware. The compartment was entirely empty. A cold, creeping sensation of dread began to slither up his spine, replacing the warm glow of his earlier arrogance. Simone leaned over his shoulder, her heavy pearl-encrusted gown rustling against his tuxedo. She peered into the box, her patronizing smile faltering as she questioned why on earth I would send a simple electronic tablet as a wedding gift to a family of their immense stature. Julian did not answer her. He could not speak. His eyes remained locked on the dark glass screen as a terrifying realization began to take root in his panicked mind. He reached out and touched the surface of the tablet. The highly sensitive light sensors, having been exposed to the brilliant glare of the ballroom chandeliers, immediately registered the change in environment. The iPad powered on with a sudden blinding flash of pure white light. Julian flinched instinctively, recoiling from the sudden brightness. The custom-programmed interface booted up instantaneously, locking out all manual controls. Julian frantically mashed the volume buttons and tapped wildly at the edges of the screen, desperately trying to force the device to power down or return to a standard home menu. The tablet was completely unresponsive to his physical commands, operating entirely on the malicious code my cybersecurity team had flawlessly installed. The stark white background faded to black and large. Blood-red numbers materialized in the dead center of the high-definition display. It was a digital countdown timer executing its command with ruthless, terrifying precision. The number 3 flashed across the screen, holding for exactly 1 second. Julian let out a choked, breathless gasp, his hands hovering uselessly over the locked device. The number 2 appeared bright and menacing, illuminating his sweating, terrified face. My mother half rose from her seat, her maternal instincts finally detecting the sheer horror radiating from her golden child. The number 1 blazed onto the glass, locking into place as the final sequence of the code executed its ultimate directive. The digital executioner was fully armed and ready to strike. Julian stood paralyzed, unable to look away from the glowing red digit, bracing himself for an impact he could neither predict nor prevent. At the exact millisecond the countdown timer reached 0, the high-range Bluetooth audio override transmitter, hardwired into the tablet's battery matrix, violently engaged. The military-grade hardware operated with terrifying speed, aggressively scanning the ballroom's digital environment and instantly locating the master receiver for the hotel's state-of-the-art audio-visual system. It mercilessly breached the venue's network security, overriding the commercial firewalls as if they were made of paper. The 12-piece live orchestra had been playing a soft, romantic jazz melody to accompany the dinner service, their instruments amplified through the massive high-fidelity speakers suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Suddenly, A deafening, violent blast of static feedback tore through the elegant ballroom, shattering the sophisticated atmosphere. Hundreds of guests violently flinched, dropping their silver forks and covering their ears to block out the agonizing noise. The band's microphones were instantly severed from the system, plunging the musicians into an abrupt, confused silence. The sound engineer frantically manipulated his mixing console at the back of the room, completely locked out of his own equipment by the aggressive transmitter resting on the head table. The physical hijacking was absolute and uncompromising. Simultaneously, the visual takeover commenced. Behind the raised bridal dais, three massive high-definition projector screens had been displaying a continuous, beautifully curated slideshow of Julian and Simone's romantic engagement photographs from Paris and Aspen. Without warning, the smiling images of the golden couple abruptly vanished. The massive screens went pitch black, plunging the front of the ballroom into a sudden, ominous shadow. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of 500 elite guests, their conversations dying instantly as they stared up at the dead monitors. Simone's father, the powerful federal judge, slammed his hand onto his table, his face contorting with deep annoyance at the catastrophic technical failure interrupting his daughter's flawless reception. He gestured angrily toward the hotel management staff, demanding an immediate fix. But the hotel staff was entirely powerless. The screens did not remain dark for long. They flared back to life with a blinding, harsh white glow that washed over the entire wedding party, illuminating their horrified faces for the entire room to see. The sophisticated audio-visual system of the Buckhead Ritz-Carlton was no longer under the control of the venue. It belonged entirely to me. The intricate trap I had constructed in my Washington office had crossed state lines, infiltrated the most exclusive social event of the year, and successfully taken the entire room hostage. The electronic silence that followed the static blast was heavy, loaded with a terrifying anticipation. The system was primed, locked, and ready to broadcast the absolute destruction of my family's fabricated empire to every single powerful dignitary in attendance. Julian stared at the glowing screens above him, his entire body trembling violently, as he finally realized that the sleek device in the velvet box was not his financial salvation, but the instrument of his total annihilation. The pristine high-definition audio file initiated without a single second of hesitation. It did not start with a low murmur or a gradual buildup. It blasted through the Ritz-Carlton's superior acoustics at maximum volume, commanding the absolute attention of every single politician, socialite, and religious leader in the room. The crisp recording from the dimly lit cigar lounge sliced through the heavy perfumed air. Julian's own voice echoed off the sparkling crystal chandeliers, sounding arrogant, deeply unhinged, and entirely unguarded. The audio captured the clinking of their whiskey glasses and the scratching of a match lighting Richard's cigar, placing the guests right inside the room with the conspirators. The guests sat frozen in their velvet chairs as the audio captured Julian explicitly bragging about his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. The entire ballroom listened in stunned, breathless silence as my brother proudly detailed exactly how he bypassed the security protocols of his future father-in-law's church. His recorded voice laughed while explaining the sheer ease with which he had embezzled over $2.5 million from the charity housing fund. He shamelessly gloated about using Simone's administrative access to siphon the donations of thousands of working-class parishioners directly into his failing offshore accounts. The Golden Child was literally narrating his own federal indictment to an audience of 500 powerful witnesses. The sheer volume of the broadcast made it impossible to ignore or misunderstand. Waitstaff stopped dead in their tracks, trays of expensive champagne hovering frozen in mid-air. Simone sat at the head table, her mouth falling open in a display of unadulterated horror as she listened to the man she was about to marry confess to robbing her family blind. Julian frantically clawed at the iPad, his manicured fingers slipping uselessly against the tempered glass as he desperately tried to muffle the speakers. The device remained completely impenetrable, continuing to broadcast his arrogance to the entire Washington and Atlanta elite. Just as the shock of Julian's confession settled over the crowd, the audio track transitioned smoothly to my father's booming, unmistakable baritone. Richard's recorded voice resonated through the grand ballroom, cementing their collective guilt. The patriarch of the family cold-bloodedly confirmed on tape that they were actively blackmailing me, his own daughter, to cover up Julian's massive federal crime. The audience gasped, collectively, as Richard proudly admitted to threatening my public relations firm, detailing his ruthless plan to sabotage my livelihood unless I handed over my grandfather's commercial property deed as collateral. The recording captured Richard and Julian laughing together, a sinister mocking chorus of morally bankrupt men who truly believed they had successfully extorted a victim into submission. They joked about sacrificing my reputation to protect the family legacy, their cruel laughter bouncing off the elegant floral-draped walls of the venue. The juxtaposition of their recorded villainy playing against the backdrop of their lavish multi-million-dollar wedding reception created a surreal, horrifying spectacle. My mother clutched her chest, her face draining of all color as she realized her entire social circle was currently listening to her family's absolute moral decay. She looked out at the sea of disgusted faces, watching her carefully constructed world disintegrate in real time. The elite guest people who relied heavily on public perception and flawless reputations immediately began to physically distance themselves from the head table, leaning away as if the bride and groom were suddenly contagious. The elite crowd realized they were attending a celebration funded entirely by stolen charity money. The betrayal was absolute, and the audio evidence was irrefutable. Before the horrified crowd could even begin to process the devastating auditory confession, the visual assault commenced. The three massive projector screens positioned directly behind the wedding party flickered violently. The blinding white light abruptly shifted, replaced by a rapid, high-resolution slideshow of irrefutable forensic evidence. The screens flashed massive, blown-up images of the official Securities and Exchange Commission freeze orders displaying Julian's full legal name printed in stark, bold lettering. The digital display highlighted the exact federal codes for wire fraud and suspected money laundering. Next, the presentation seamlessly transitioned to screenshots of Julian's Cayman Island offshore accounts, specifically zooming in on the balances that showed $0 and 0 cents. The evidence exposed him not just as a criminal, but as a completely broke, incompetent fraud. The final visual blow arrived as the screens illuminated with the formal federal audit notices generated by the poison pill I had signed. The documents bore the unmistakable red stamps of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The financial doom of the family was now a spectacular public exhibit, 50 feet wide and impossible to deny. Down in the most prominent section of the ballroom, Simone's father slowly rose from his seat. The imposing bishop and federal judge stood up, pushing his heavy dining chair back with such force that it toppled over onto the polished marble floor. He did not care about the noise. His towering figure commanded immediate fear. He stared up at the projector screens, processing the catastrophic reality flashing before his eyes. He looked at the bank routing numbers, recognizing the specific charitable accounts his congregation had built with their hard-earned tithes. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. His sacred church had been systematically robbed, and the thief was sitting at the head table. Worse than the financial theft was the profound personal betrayal. The judge realized that his daughter, his precious Simone, had been used as a convenient human shield, a literal access key to bypass the church's secure administrative firewalls. The man she was marrying never loved her. He merely saw her as a prime opportunity for grand larceny. The bishop's face contorted into a mask of absolute unyielding rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He turned his terrifying, righteous fury toward the bridal dais. Simone was sobbing hysterically, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark streaks, ruining her expensive couture gown. She reached out toward Julian, seeking an explanation, but he cowered away from her. The judge took a heavy, menacing step toward the head table, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles cracked. The surrounding politicians and elite socialites parted ways instantly, scrambling backward to give the furious patriarch a wide berth. The tension in the ballroom snapped, replaced by the chaotic rising murmur of 500 panicked guests, realizing they were caught in the epicenter of a massive federal scandal. Julian backed away from the table, his chair tipping backward and crashing to the floor. His hands shook violently as he finally let go of the black velvet box. He dropped the sleek iPad onto the pristine white tablecloth, treating it as if the metal chassis had suddenly caught fire. The device clattered against the fine crystal glasses, spilling champagne across the expensive silk linens. He stared at the approaching bishop, then at his horrified mother, and finally out at the sea of disgusted elite guests. The crushing weight of his reality descended upon him all at once. There was no loophole, no bailout, and no scapegoat left to sacrifice. He was a penniless, exposed criminal surrounded by the very people he had tried to impress. Julian threw his head back and let out a visceral, piercing scream of sheer terror, the sound raw and entirely stripped of his usual arrogance. His scream echoed through the vast space, cutting sharply through the remaining static of the hijacked audio system. At that exact, meticulously timed moment, the grand mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst open with explosive, shattering force. The heavy wood slammed against the interior walls, silencing the entire panicked crowd. The sheer force of the raid sent shockwaves through the room, causing several prominent politicians to instantly drop their drinks and scramble for the emergency exits, desperate to distance themselves from the fallout. Dozens of federal agents flooded into the opulent reception space, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division poured through the entrance clad in dark tactical gear and heavy Kevlar vests. The contrast between the heavily armed federal operatives and the delicate flower-draped luxury of the venue was absolute and jarring. The agents fanned out across the marble floors, shouting clear, authoritative commands that paralyzed the wealthy attendees. They raised their badges high into the air, the golden shields catching the light from the sparkling chandeliers overhead. The lead FBI agent locked his eyes directly on the bridal dais, raising his hand and pointing a firm, uncompromising finger straight at Julian. The golden child's extravagant, fraudulent fantasy had reached its violent, inescapable conclusion. The ultimate trap had successfully snapped shut, burying them all beneath the wreckage of their own insatiable greed. The meticulously constructed facade of generational wealth and untouchable elite status evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the cold, harsh reality of federal prosecution and total social ruin. Absolute pandemonium erupted inside the grand ballroom of the Buckhead Ritz-Carlton. The perfectly orchestrated illusion of high society elegance completely shattered under the heavy tactical boots of federal agents. Simone let out a piercing, hysterical wail that cut through the chaotic shouting. Her legs gave out beneath the heavy weight of her pearl-encrusted couture gown, and she collapsed violently onto the polished marble floor. She tore frantically at her expensive custom veil, sobbing uncontrollably as her father, the furious federal judge, forcefully pulled her away from the active crime scene. Two burly Federal Bureau of Investigation operatives bypassed the weeping bride and lunged directly for the golden child. Julian did not even attempt to run. His legs were paralyzed by sheer, unadulterated terror. The agents grabbed him roughly by the lapels of his tailored tuxedo and slammed him face first onto the main head table. Crystal champagne flutes shattered instantly upon impact, sending sharp shards of glass and expensive vintage wine splashing across the pristine white silk linens. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs locking securely around Julian's wrists echoed loudly over the terrified screaming of the crowd. He wept openly, a pathetic, broken mess, pressing his face into the spilled champagne, begging his father to do something to stop the nightmare. But Richard could not help him. A separate squad of Internal Revenue Service criminal investigators had already cornered my parents. Richard attempted to puff out his chest and invoke his powerful fraternity connections, indignantly demanding to speak to the lead agent's supervisor. His arrogant protests were swiftly silenced when an operative firmly spun him around, kicking his legs apart and securing his wrists tightly behind his back. Vivica shrieked in absolute horror as a female agent read her Miranda rights, officially detaining her for conspiracy and active extortion. My mother struggled against the restraints, her emerald evening gown tearing slightly at the shoulder as she was marched forcefully past the melting ice sculptures. The most devastating blow for my parents was not the physical arrest, but the social execution. The elite guests, the politicians, and the powerful socialites did not look away in respectful silence. Instead, hundreds of smartphones were instantly raised high into the air. The bright flashes of phone cameras illuminated the ballroom, capturing every humiliating second of the family's total annihilation. The untouchable dynasty was being live-streamed to the entire world, permanently cementing their status as disgraced, ruined frauds. 48 hours later, the dust had finally settled over the smoldering, catastrophic ruins of my family's fabricated empire. I was standing on the expansive wooden deck of my Malibu villa when my personal cell phone began to ring. The caller identification display showed an incoming transmission from a federal holding facility located in downtown Atlanta. I answered the call, letting the line remain completely silent on my end. My mother's voice cracked through the receiver, stripped entirely of her usual aristocratic superiority. Vivica was sobbing uncontrollably, her words slurring together in a frantic, desperate plea. She had used her one permitted phone call from the grim detention center to dial the very daughter she had spent her entire life marginalizing and attempting to destroy. She begged me to activate my crisis management agency immediately. She pleaded with me to deploy my elite public relations operatives to spin the toxic narrative, to bury the massive scandal in the press, and to use my vast political leverage to somehow negotiate a federal plea deal that would save them all from spending decades in prison. She promised over and over that she would change, claiming that she finally recognized my true value and immense power. She offered me frantic apologies, dripping with raw, pathetic panic, desperately trying to manipulate my emotions one last time. She cried out that Julian was terrified in his concrete holding cell, and that my father was suffering from severe chest pains due to the intense public humiliation. She demanded that I fulfill my duty as her loyal daughter and rescue the family name from absolute permanent disgrace. She wailed loudly into the phone, begging me to please just tell her what I was going to do to fix this nightmare. I stood quietly looking out over the vast, glittering expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The warm California sun beat down on my shoulders, and the rhythmic, soothing sound of the ocean waves crashing against the sandy shore provided a perfectly peaceful background to my mother's hysterical weeping. I did not feel a single ounce of pity, guilt, or familial obligation. My mind was entirely clear, and my heart was finally permanently freed from their toxic, manipulative grip. I took a slow, deep breath of the fresh, salty sea air, letting the absolute tranquility of the coast wash over me. My voice was ice cold, perfectly calm, and completely devoid of mercy when I finally replied to her desperate, sobbing demands. I told her that I had explicitly and flawlessly completed her 3 specific conditions. I reminded her that I gave them the commercial property deed they demanded without a fight. I sat entirely in the background, making myself completely invisible during the wedding festivities, just as she wanted. And I stayed entirely out of their way, allowing them to bask in their unearned, fraudulent glory. I informed her that I had played my assigned role to absolute perfection. I told her to enjoy the consequences of her own actions. I did not wait to hear her response. I did not listen to her final frantic scream echoing through the receiver. I simply tapped the red button on the screen and hung up the phone. I powered down the device entirely, dropped it carelessly into my woven beach bag, and turned my face toward the glowing golden horizon. I kicked off my sandals and stepped down onto the warm, soft sand. I walked slowly toward the magnificent sunset, leaving the wreckage of my past 3,000 miles behind me. I was completely free, entirely untouchable, and absolutely victorious.